apologize in advance. I have things in both of my hands, and I am not an ambidextrous baddie. So this will be an experience for both of us, or not both of us, there's a lot of us here, all of us. So hello everyone, my name is Bree, and like Madison so kindly said, I am a front-end software engineer turned developer advocate at HubSpot, and I'm so excited to talk today about how to choose the right React styling solution. So I am always on TikTok. It's one of the things that I am low-key addicted to, but we're not going to talk about that today. But one of my very favorite trends that I've ever seen on TikTok is the we listen and we don't judge, which is basically where people get up on TikTok and they talk about these crazy wild stories, and then they expect people not to judge them or say anything about the experiences that they've had. So I've noticed that we don't necessarily do the same thing in the tech industry, so I'm bringing that energy here today. Hold on 1 second, sorry. Oh, now you guys can see what I was gonna say. How sad. Now it doesn't look like I was doing everything on my own. But I still can't see it over here. Oh, I lied. Yeah, I can. I just don't know how technology works. That's okay. Anywho, I will always listen and not judge. However, I will be watching from the sidelines like this. And with all of the things that have happened in the React styling world recently, this is exactly how I have been looking when I'm seeing things on Twitter and everywhere else. So I don't know if y'all have seen or have been in the group chat, but recently React styling has gotten just a little bit spicy. So React 19 has dropped, Tailwind has basically reinvented itself with Tailwind v4, and native CSS is in its glow-up era, and the maintainer of styled components said that maybe it's time for us to go ahead and move on. So today what we're gonna be doing is unpacking what's really going on with styling here in 2025. We're gonna see what's falling apart, what the right styling approach might be, and we're gonna make sure that you're not crying in your code reviews when it comes to styling as well. And I know that it is a little bit low on the bottom, so for anybody who is in the back and can't see, the bottom says that styled components has left the chat. So before we dive too far into any of the styling methods and how they actually work, I want to really see what is going on with styling here in 2025. So this is the results that were gathered from the latest State of CSS survey in 2024. And if you've never seen it, I highly, highly, highly recommend that you go check it out to see what developers are currently using, what they're currently interested in, and what their styling philosophies are as well. So according to the survey, Tailwind is sitting comfortably at the top with 75% of voters saying that they have used Tailwind before in the CSS frameworks category. So then we can move on to the CSS and JS, and we see that CSS modules are still holding it down with 61% of voters saying that they've used it before, which proves to us that vanilla CSS is still a preference and it's still reliable. And then we have styled components, which is right behind it, and we can see that 59% of voters in that category say they've used it. And as a bonus, Sass is still very much the leader with 67% of voters saying that they've used it before or that they are currently using it. But what will be interesting is to see if that actually continues now that so many of its core features are being added to native CSS. So we're seeing a lot of different philosophies across styling. We're seeing utility first, we're seeing scope CSS, and we're seeing CSS and JS. So now that we've seen who's leading the boards, let's take a deeper look and understand what each one of these styling options are and understand why developers are drawn to them. So let's go ahead and start with a classic. It's CSS Modules. So these are basically a way to write regular CSS that you already know and love, but just scope them to your components automatically. So this means that you don't have to worry about your styles being automatically overridden by different parts of your app. So what draws developers to CSS modules? I think it's basically, it feels comfortable. It's something that you already know, but it's just scoped. They're great for small to medium code bases, and there's no runtime cost at all, and it's super SSR friendly, which is really important today. CSS modules are compiled at build time, and basically, if you want to move fast and theme your whole app with tokens, we may need to look at something a little bit different, especially if you don't want to write the classes themselves, and that's where CSS utility frameworks like Tailwind come in. So when we talk about Tailwind, it is something that people love or they don't love. I've heard it both ways. So show of hands, who likes Tailwind and like that is the thing that you reach for styling? Okay. Who's on the other side where you feel like you don't love it, it makes you worse at writing CSS, it takes you too far away? Okay. I like that you raised your hands real high too. So, like I said, it's one of those things that people love or they hate, but it's here to stay nonetheless. So with Tailwind, you don't write traditional CSS. You basically write the styles inside of your markup itself with predefined utility classes. So Tailwind works by scanning your markup to see what classes you're actually using, and then it generates a style sheet of only what you've used. And it's powered by design tokens. So think your spacing, your fonts, your colors, and everything like that. And in earlier versions, this was all done through a tailwind.config.js, but that's changing in Tailwind version 4. And it's actually part of a pretty big shift that we're seeing in the CSS world, but we'll get to that in the next section. So what draws developers to Tailwind? I think that there's honestly two big things. I think the first one is speed. You don't have to worry about switching files constantly, and it enables you to move fast because you don't have to write those classes yourself. And I think the other thing is really consistency. You can define those design tokens and really enforce across your apps or across your teams how they're being used. And the next up in our trio is going to be styled components. So this is a CSS and JS solution that works where you are writing scoped CSS files directly inside of your JavaScript, or in this case, inside of your React components. So what you do is use tag template literals, and they are basically injected into the head of your project at runtime, and this binds them to the component that you're using. So this means that styles are directly coupled to your logic and to your props, which is really great for dynamic UIs, and you can style based on props, themes, media queries, or even JavaScript functions as well. So it includes a built-in theming solution using React context, so you can define your design tokens at once and then access them anywhere in your app using a theme provider. So the styling landscape has changed. We've looked at the three major players there are currently, which are CSS Modules, Tailwind, and Style Components. But what happens when these three technologies meet the world of React 19 and the modern front-end landscape? They say the only thing that is constant in life is change, and that's so true. I know a couple of people here who were at Commit Your Code last year where I gave this talk for the first time, and you can probably see that this talk has changed drastically because there's been so many drastic changes already in just a couple of months. So suddenly, the way that we think about styling isn't just changing, it's almost being reimagined. So React 19 introduced a couple of different new features that are going to affect how we style things moving forward, and I just want to talk about a couple of them super quickly. So the first one is form state. If you've ever had to style a button to be maybe disabled or show a loading spinner when you are submitting a form, this is going to change how you do it. So instead of manually wiring up your own state and error handling, React 19 gives us the ability to pass async functions directly to our forms and to our buttons, and this is going to help with progressive enhancement and really align React more closely with the platform. And then we also have a new hook that's called Use Form State, and this allows us to automatically access those like pending, error, and data without having to do so much prop drilling. Next, we have optimistic UI enhancements, and this is something I'm actually really excited about because you know if you've ever had to design based on an intended action or something that has not fully completed yet, it can really be a pain. So basically, we have Use Optimistic, which is a new hook that does that for us. And one of the great things is if the server action doesn't complete or it fails for whatever reason, it rolls back to the previous UI for us automatically. So basically, what this is telling, oh, just kidding, wrong slide. The next thing is there's less emphasis on context. I was getting ahead of myself, y'all. I was so excited. There's less emphasis on context, and this is one subtle but really, really big change, especially for React 19. With server components that don't support context, we're finding that libraries that do really heavily rely on context, like styled components, are seeing a decline, and it's really difficult to work with them. So they're starting to face some new constraints. But putting it all together, React 19 is telling us this. State is dynamic, and we need to be able to be flexible enough to style based on those dynamic interactions as they happen. So with React server components, like I said, starting to shake things up a little bit, a couple of weeks ago, if you have seen on the internet, the creator of styled components, or the core maintainer, I should say, has announced that not only is the library going into maintenance mode, but that he no longer suggests using CSS and JS as a styling solution at all anymore. And his reasoning was actually very clear. So the first one was that there are performance concerns. The next one was that there are SSR hydration issues, and most importantly, he felt that its reliance on context was a large detraction from being able to effectively use styled components, especially with no roadmap of how that might look in later versions of React. So styled components, which was once the go-to, like we saw on the graph earlier from the state of CSS, it was once the go-to for styling components dynamically based on props and state. Now people are actively reconsidering that, and especially teams that are building with SSR or RSC frameworks like Next.js. So if styled components is slowing down and RSC is limiting how we're using context, what tools are actively moving in React's new direction? The first one is Tailwind. So Tailwind didn't just release a few new utilities. It is almost like a full reboot of the framework, if you will. So I have a couple of items here. There was a lot. I definitely recommend going to check the changelog for all of the cool new things that are coming in Tailwind v4. But I think a few of the big ones I think are, the first one is CSS first configuration. This is really big. You do not need to have a Tailwind config anymore. And I love this. It allows you to be closer to the CSS itself because you can use the theme declaration, but it also means that we are getting away from more complex JavaScript-based setups in our styling. The next thing is that there is a new high-performance engine. Tailwind version 4 is a lot faster. For full builds, it can be up to 3.5 times faster, and for incremental builds, it can be up to 8 times faster. And the next one is that Tailwind is now better aligned with native CSS. So we're using some new things under the hood, and even if you don't use these features directly, they make Tailwind smarter and faster and more capable with CSS workflows that you might already be using. So Tailwind v4 is less about the utility classes themselves, and it's a lot more about building faster, smarter, and building CSS native platforms that evolve with modern React. So in terms of new features for CSS itself, because it has been having a glow up recently, we love it, here are just a couple of new things that are available. The first one is native CSS nesting. Now this is a big one because I used to reach for Sass originally, specifically for this. And with native CSS having nesting, I no longer have to reach for that dependency. The next thing is container queries, because they enable components to adapt their styles based on the size of their parent container and not just the viewport. The next one is the has selector, or the has pseudoclass, excuse me, and it introduces the ability for parent selectors to allow styles to be based on their child elements. So this feature reduces the need for JavaScript for a lot of interactive styling. And then we also have the scope rule, which basically allows you to specify and style specific parts of the DOM and reduce specificity, that's a hard word, specificity conflicts and enhance modularity. So what does this all mean? Because that was a lot, so let's take a deep breath. The first thing is that React 19 is changing the game. Styling is no longer just about how it looks, but it's about how the apps respond to state. The next thing is that now we can see what's changed. Nope, I'm lying. Don't worry about me. Context is limited, hydration matters, and performance is everything, especially when we think about server-side rendering and frameworks like Next.js. And then with Tailwind leaning into native CSS, styled components stepping back, and CSS leveling up, trying to figure out what you're actually going to use can be a little bit of a tricky and difficult decision. So let's talk a little bit about how these actually work in practice now that we can see that our landscape is shifting. So what I've done is I created 3 buttons. They are all the same exact button. They have a different variants so we have a primary, a secondary, and an empty. Our primary is this gorgeous hot pink. Our secondary, which it looks like we're stuck on right now, is this cute baby pink. And eventually, maybe if we get to our empty button, you'll be able to see that it's basically just empty and then pink on the inside. But you can see what variations we have here. We have something for disabled and loading to control those different states of the buttons. And we can also show an icon and adjust the sizing. So buttons are probably the most ubiquitous component that you will probably see. And if you maybe are into gaming like I am and you have ever been on Steam's website, you see that they have at least 28,000 different versions of buttons. And it's because it can be hard when your app is really big and you don't have good styling standards. I'm not saying they don't have good styling standards, but it can be hard to keep everything the exact same. So we're gonna take a look at what it would look like to create this common button across our different styling solutions. So the first one that we're going to work with is CSS Modules. Now again, CSS Modules are something that we're already familiar with. It's basically writing CSS in a way that's native to us. The only thing that's really different here is instead of a .css file, we're using a .module.css file. And right here, I'm actually doing something called using class names as a package to dynamically import those styles. And what this does is it helps to make sure that I'm not just having a long mess of conditional logic inside of my JSX. It keeps it clean. So in terms of complexity, this is probably something that we're all familiar with, just declaring our styles and importing them into our JavaScript. And so once we have our file or our styles inside of our CSS, we can import them directly into our JavaScript, and that's basically what I've done here, is just shown what those styles actually look like. It's native, we all know this. So the setup is really great, like I said, for medium and small size projects. They're predictable, there's no runtime cost, and they work really well with SSR. However, CSS modules don't have built-in theming per se. So you can style different themes with CSS variables or advanced class overrides, but as your app scales and as your app gets bigger and you add more people to your team, it's going to be cumbersome and it is going to be a pain. Also, duplication has the potential of creeping in really quickly. Because your styles are scoped to your components, you'll find that maybe you're writing similar logic across different components, and without creating your own abstraction layer, you're gonna find that you're just repeating that same logic, which is never fun. The other thing is responsiveness and dynamic states are also going to require a lot more boilerplate, and it's probably gonna require you to toggle those classes on and off on your own. So CSS modules is still a very solid choice if you want classic scoped styles without a really heavy setup. However, they do not scale as gracefully without extra tooling. And I definitely would not use it for something like high design systems, high interactivity, or multiple themes. So now let's talk about Tailwind. So the Tailwind setup, if you've used it before, is pretty simple. However, in Tailwind v4, one thing that's different is you are going to be importing Tailwind into your global CSS file, wherever that is for your app, and there is no configuration needed anymore. So in this component, what I'm doing is using Tailwind variants to do the same thing that I was doing before, where I'm creating additional logic just to make sure that my styles are nice and clean and composable. And instead of manually toggling those class names or having a lot of different ternaries or putting them all inside of my JSX. Now, instead of using a Tailwind config like I was talking about a couple seconds ago, all of those design tokens that I might need are going to go into my global CSS, which I think it says button.module.css, but I think I just forgot to change the name. Just pretend that's a global CSS file. And you're going to do that there. I love this because it brings Tailwind closer to the CSS itself, and again, not as close to JavaScript, and it's getting a little bit farther away. Now, this is fast and powerful, but you will need to stay organized. You have to have good naming conventions because as your token list grows, managing these purely in CSS can get really unwieldy without good naming conventions and without good structure. And that structure is going to have to follow you to your markup as well. One of the community's biggest pain points is that the markup looks ugly and that it is really hard to figure out what's going on with Tailwind. And I totally agree. However, if you can use atomic design to create those components and work on the structure of your markup, it makes it a lot easier to use, and it's a lot easier to debug and manage as well. So for maintenance and scalability, Tailwind works really well for things like design systems, especially when, like I said, you pair it with Tailwind variants, which also helps you to keep track of what those different variants might look like. And it gives you guardrails with flexibility without needing to add like a separate theming engine or runtime styles. So if your team is working across multiple different apps or you really just need something to be consistent and fast, I definitely recommend Tailwind. So our next one up is styled components, and it basically lets you, like I said, use tag template literals. Now, styled components gets a little bit tricky in terms of setup. It's not as easy to spin up as CSS modules or as Tailwind. I'm using Next.js, and I had to do something like this, which is creating a registry for styled components, because with server-side rendering, you may get a flash of unstyled content where your page loads and the markup is there, but you can quickly see that it's just a regular HTML file before those styles load and hydrate. So to prevent that, I had to add this registry just to make sure that that doesn't happen. And then inside of the component itself, basically what you do is you define whatever element it is, and you apply those styles, just native CSS, directly in there. So what I'm doing, because I have a couple of different variations of styles, is just using different helper functions to make sure that I'm keeping that styling clean. But we can see that this is regular CSS that's happening in here. I'm using hover states, colors, fonts, everything like that. It's just happening inside of my JavaScript. So in terms of maintenance, it scales well for highly dynamic UIs if you need prop-based styling. But it does come with some really, really heavy trade-offs. So the first one, like I said, is runtime overhead. Because this is injected directly into the head at runtime, it can really affect your performance, especially if you have a lot of styled elements on the page. So do you need to start thinking about getting off of styled components right now? I don't necessarily think so. So while the core maintainer of styled components has said maybe it's time to take a step back, not because it's an anti-pattern or because CSS and JS never worked, I think the logic here is that with React 19 and the path that it's going down, the performance limitations and the cost are getting to be worth a little bit more than the effort that you would put in to use them. So if you are going to be doing something like exploring another CSS and JS solution, like maybe Emotion or Vanilla Extract, I would think twice about whether you actually need it or whether there's a different solution for you. Or if you're going to do another styling solution, whatever it is, the main thing to think about is making sure that you are aligned with where native CSS is and React's current direction. Because here's the thing, there's going to be a cost. There's a cost if you were to do something like rip out all of styled components now and replace it with something else. But if you kick that can down the line, there is also the possibility that you are going to pay a cost when you're breaking things constantly and having to fix them again as well. So how do you actually go about making the decision? We've talked about a couple of different options, and I'm pretty sure you want to know, which one do you pick? And the answer is every developer's favorite answer. It depends. So we've looked at our different styling methods, and the real question is, how do you choose a styling method that works for you, not just in theory, but in actuality? How do you do it for your actual app? How do you do it for your actual team, for your actual constraints? And I think it comes down to making sure that you're asking yourself a couple of different questions. It's about what scales, what performs, and what is going to survive the next refactor of your app. So this is a list of questions that I've compiled for things that I think are important here in 2025 with the state of the tools that we have now. So the first one is, will it work with server components? Can you style your pending states, your optimistic states easily without duct tape and without having to do a lot of different hacky stuff? Is it scalable for design systems? And that's not just for people who are developing design systems. That should be for anybody who is creating an app. You want to make sure that your atomic components are scalable. Is it going to bloat your bundle or block your hydration? Super important, especially if you are going down the route of more server components or using a framework like Next.js. And is it taking advantage of everything that modern CSS is going to give you? So here's the thing. There is no one correct styling method, but there are tools that work better than others depending on what your needs are. So if you need speed, consistently, and strong design system support, I think that's really where Tailwind shines, especially when paired with something like Tailwind Variants. There's all kinds of different plugins that are supported to make that development process a lot easier. And when you compare it with Atomic design approach, it really helps me to move fast and scale consistently across teams. If you're looking for something simple, scoped styles and no runtime, CSS Modules does shine there. It is reliable, but again, for those smaller projects. And then if your components really need to be styled deeply in dynamic ways, CSS and JS, maybe not styled components, maybe something like Emotion or Vanilla Extract could take its place. But again, I would be really thoughtful in reaching for those these days. At the end of the day, no matter what you do, styling React is not just a tech decision. It is a product decision, it is a team decision, and it, most importantly, is a you decision. So whatever you choose, just make sure that it serves your team, make sure that it serves your app, and where front end is headed. That's how we build apps that feel good to maintain, that scale well with our teams, and still look really freaking good. But if anybody's wondering what I'm gonna grab every single time for right now, it's Tailwind. So thank you all so much. I would love to chat with you more if you are interested in styling, if you want to know what you should do, or maybe if the news about styled components was like a little bit jarring and you're trying to figure out where that's going, I would love to chat with you as well. And I have the GitHub repo for all of the styling components that I did as well, so you can kind of take a look at them and compare the actual code itself. So thank you.